Ethan Miller, all of 12 years old, had never flown solo before. According to the airline's policy and his dad's confidence, he was old enough to handle it. Still, his palms couldn't help but get a little sweaty as he clutched his boarding pass. The straps of his backpack dug into his shoulders, but he didn't mind. Inside was everything he needed: snacks, a sketchbook, headphones, and a folded letter from his mom. "Sit by the window and look at the mountains," she'd written. "You'll feel like you're flying over a painting." He kept rereading that line. Seattle wasn't home, but it was where he was headed for a 2-week robotics camp his dad had helped sponsor. He was the only kid from his middle school going, and the pride on his mom's face when they dropped him off that morning was still fresh in his mind. Ethan had followed every rule. He checked in early, got his gate information, and waited in line like everyone else. The gate agent scanned the other passengers through, one by one, but when it was his turn, something shifted. She stood there in a navy blazer, her red lipstick a shade off from her tone, and with that air some people have when they've decided they're too important to answer basic questions. Her name tag read Karen Davis. She glanced at him, but not at his pass. "Are you lost?" "No," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm boarding for Flight 262 to Seattle." She didn't reach for the scanner, didn't look at the monitor. She just tilted her head slightly. "Where are your parents?" she asked. "I'm flying alone," he replied, pulling out the printed confirmation. "My dad already boarded earlier." "For you, a free like is easy, but for me it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." That's when she sighed, one of those long, slow sighs that said more than words. "We don't just let kids wander up here on their own," she said, folding her arms. "I'm not wandering," Ethan said, holding the ticket out again. "It's right here." But instead of taking it, she reached for the paper with 2 fingers, scanned it for all of 3 seconds, and without warning ripped it clean down the middle. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. All he could do was stare at the 2 halves in her hand. "There," she said flatly. "Now you'll wait here until we figure out who you really are. I've seen enough fake passes in my career to know when something doesn't look right." The room seemed to tilt for a second. People in line behind him looked confused. A couple exchanged glances, but no one said anything, not a word. "I didn't do anything," Ethan muttered, his voice starting to shake. "You're being disruptive now," Karen snapped. "Don't make this harder on yourself." Disruptive. That word echoed louder than her voice. He looked around, waiting for someone to step in. The gate agents, the other staff, even the security officer leaning by the wall. But it was like he'd vanished, like his presence was a problem no one wanted to be responsible for. Karen waved at a second attendant, a younger guy with a headset. "Can you call someone from TSA? We might have a situation." That's when the fear started to crawl in. He wasn't scared of flying. He was scared of this, being stuck in public, singled out, made small in front of strangers for doing nothing wrong. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a dismissal. His fingers closed around the letter from his mom in his jacket pocket. He didn't pull it out. He just held it like a secret. And still, no one moved. But just when it felt like everything around him had decided to ignore what was happening, someone was watching. The terminal wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. Wheelie bags rolled past. A baby was crying somewhere near the charging station, and a businessman tapped at his laptop 2 rows away. All these things kept happening like nothing was wrong. Ethan stood there, still holding the torn edges of his ticket, not sure whether to sit down or stay standing. He hadn't cried, not yet, but his eyes were starting to sting. The younger flight attendant, the one with the headset, looked uncomfortable. His name tag said Kevin, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he wanted to say something but didn't. Meanwhile, Karen stood with her arms crossed, acting like she'd just prevented a major security breach instead of humiliating a 12-year-old in front of strangers. Ethan tried again. "Ma'am, if you just scan my name, my dad's already on the plane. His name is Robert Miller." That made her pause for a second, a flicker of recognition in her expression, but she buried it fast. "I don't care whose name you throw around," she replied. "I've been doing this job 20 years. I know when something smells off." "I didn't lie about anything. You're being combative now," she said. "You want to make this worse?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't have words, but because he didn't want to give her anything else to twist. The TSA officer finally arrived, a stocky man in his 50s chewing gum and wearing mirrored sunglasses indoors. He glanced at Ethan, then at Karen. "What's going on?" "Possible fake ticket. He claims he's flying alone, doesn't have proper ID, and he's getting smart with staff." The officer raised an eyebrow at Ethan. "You got a guardian here?" "My dad's on the plane already." "Your name?" "Ethan Miller." The officer pulled out a tablet and started typing. After a few seconds, he looked back at Karen. "We got a Miller on the manifest. 2 of them, actually. Looks like Robert Miller checked in about 30 minutes ago, and the minor was confirmed for UM service." "UM service?" Karen asked, confused. "Unaccompanied minor," he said bluntly. "The system's clean. He's legit." Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't say much, just stood there, arms still crossed, like the facts were somehow disrespecting her opinion. The TSA officer turned to Ethan. "You all right, kid?" Ethan nodded. He wasn't really, but he wasn't about to say that to this guy. "All good here," the officer muttered, stepping back. "Looks like someone jumped the gun." But Karen wasn't letting go that easily. "Well, he still shouldn't have approached the gate alone. There are procedures." "No." Kevin finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "He followed the rules. He even checked in with me at the front desk an hour ago. I verified his ID and everything." Karen shot him a look that could cut drywall, but Kevin didn't back down. That's when something shifted. Not in the air, but in the way people were watching. A woman sitting nearby, probably in her late 30s, spoke up. "I saw him standing there with his ticket. He didn't do anything wrong." Someone else murmured, "Yeah, this doesn't feel right." The spell was cracking slowly. Ethan glanced around, still gripping the remains of his boarding pass. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want a scene. He just wanted someone to look at him and say, "I see what happened, and it wasn't okay." Kevin tapped his earpiece. "We need a supervisor at Gate C12 now." Karen didn't say anything. She just stood stiff, lips pursed, still holding on to whatever pride she had wrapped around her authority. Ethan stepped back, still silent. He was too tired to argue, too shaken to speak. But the silence wasn't crushing anymore. It had turned into something else, an opening. But before anyone could say more or fix what had already been broken, a voice called out from behind the security barrier, calm, direct, and unmistakably in control. The voice cut through the tension without raising its volume. "Is there a reason my son isn't on that plane?" Every head at the gate turned. He wasn't tall in the way people expect power to be, no broad shoulders or booming voice. But Robert Miller didn't need that. He walked with purpose, shoulders relaxed, chin steady, eyes that didn't dart or flinch. He wore a plain slate-grey jacket, open over a white button-down, and no one would have guessed what he was worth by looking at him. Except Kevin. His eyes widened instantly. "Mr. Miller, sir, I thought you'd already boarded." "I stayed behind to observe," Robert said. "We've had staffing complaints on this route. I wanted to see it for myself." He looked over at Ethan, still clutching the torn ticket. "And it looks like I saw more than I expected." Karen shifted on her heels. "I wasn't aware you weren't supposed to be." He interrupted politely, not angrily, just enough to let her know he was running the conversation now. Ethan stepped toward him, finally releasing the breath he'd been holding since the moment his pass was torn. "Dad?" "You all right?" Robert asked. Ethan nodded faintly, voice dry. "She said I had a fake ticket and tore it up." Robert didn't flinch. He turned to Karen. "Did you scan his name?" Well, no, I didn't get that far." "Did you check the UM list? The tag on his backpack has a barcode that links to his manifest." "I didn't think I needed to." "You didn't think," Robert said, his voice still calm. "You assumed." Karen's cheeks flushed, but she didn't move. Kevin stepped in again, voice a little firmer this time. "He was checked in properly. I verified the UM status myself. The system flagged no issues." Robert nodded once. "Then why was his ticket destroyed?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. "I'd like a supervisor now," Robert said, still not raising his voice. "And I'd like this entire exchange reviewed on the gate security feed. That includes the moment my son was stopped, the conversation you had with him, and the exact time his boarding pass was destroyed." Kevin tapped his headset again. "Already on it, sir." The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one sitting near the gate, rose from her seat and walked over. "I saw the whole thing," she said. "Your son was polite. He said he was flying alone and showed his pass. She didn't even read it. For you, a free like is easy, but for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." Robert turned to her, offering a slight nod. "Thank you." Karen's arms fell to her sides. She looked smaller now, still standing tall, but something had buckled under her posture. "I didn't know who he was," she said finally, grasping at some kind of excuse. "That's the problem," Robert replied. "It shouldn't matter who he is." A heavy silence followed, one that didn't need filling. A supervisor appeared moments later, walking briskly, his badge catching the overhead lights. "Mr. Mill, my sincere apologies for the delay," the supervisor said, looking around quickly. "We were just informed of the issue." "We need a report filed," Robert said, "and I want assurance that my son boards without further interference." "Yes, of course. He's cleared to board. We'll issue a new ticket immediately." Ethan said nothing. He was still staring at the scraps of paper in his hand. Robert gently touched his shoulder. "You good to fly?" Ethan nodded again, but his voice was just a whisper. "I just didn't get why she looked at me like that." Robert didn't answer right away. He looked at his son, then back at Karen. She saw what she wanted to see, not what was there. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, would you like us to handle this internally, or—" "I'll file my own report," Robert said. "I'm not here for drama. I'm here for accountability." The words hung there for a moment, sharp but not cruel. But even as procedures resumed and apologies were muttered, something deeper had already taken root. This wasn't going to end with a new boarding pass. Ethan stood near the window, now away from the crowd, watching the tarmac while the gate agent scrambled to reprint his boarding pass. Robert remained at the center of it all, surrounded by people who suddenly remembered how to look busy. But he wasn't letting this moment pass quietly. Karen had retreated behind the gate desk, pretending to double-check seating charts that didn't need checking. She knew eyes were on her now. Robert walked over deliberately, not angry, just clear. "You didn't just tear up a boarding pass," he said calmly. "You tore up a moment my son had been looking forward to for weeks." Karen's hand paused on the keyboard. She didn't look at him. "I made a judgment call." "No," he replied. "You made a judgment, full stop." She slowly turned toward him, her mouth tightening. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm pointing out something that already happened," Robert said. "You made a decision about my son the second you saw him, before he spoke, before you scanned his name, before you did your job." She crossed her arms again, almost instinctively. "I was protecting the integrity of the flight. We are trained to spot inconsistencies." "And your inconsistency was what exactly?" he asked. "A child standing in line with a valid ticket, quietly waiting his turn." Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to defend. The security footage had already been flagged. Kevin had made sure of that. The supervisor stood just a few feet away, listening, not interrupting. "You know what the worst part is?" Robert continued. "You didn't think twice about it, not until you realized who I was. And even then, you weren't sorry. You were scrambling." Her face flushed again. She glanced at the supervisor, maybe hoping for backup, but he stayed silent. "I've spent years building this airline," Robert said, his voice low, "not because I needed to, but because I believed travel could feel fair, inclusive, like you belonged in the sky, no matter what your name was. And today you reminded me just how much further we have to go." Karen stared at the floor. Robert wasn't done. "You thought no one would notice that. No one would care enough to speak up. And most days you're probably right." He gestured to the crowd around them, many of whom had resumed their travel routines. Some were still watching, others had gone back to their phones and laptops like nothing had happened. "That's the danger, Karen. Silence, not just from you, but from everyone who sees something and chooses to pretend it didn't happen." Her voice cracked just slightly. "I didn't mean to." She crossed her arms again, almost instinctively. "I was protecting the integrity of the flight. We are trained to spot inconsistencies." "And your inconsistency was what, exactly?" he asked. "A child standing in line with a valid ticket, quietly waiting his turn." Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to defend. The security footage had already been flagged. Kevin had made sure of that. The supervisor stood just a few feet away, listening, not interrupting. "You know what the worst part is?" Robert continued. "You didn't think twice about it, not until you realized who I was. And even then, you weren't sorry. You were scrambling." Her face flushed again. She glanced at the supervisor, maybe hoping for backup, but he stayed silent. "I've spent years building this airline," Robert said, his voice low, "not because I needed to, but because I believed travel could feel fair, inclusive, like you belonged in the sky, no matter what your name was. And today you reminded me just how much further we have to go." Karen stared at the floor. Robert wasn't done. "You thought no one would notice that. No one would care enough to speak up. And most days you're probably right." He gestured to the crowd around them, many of whom had resumed their travel routines. Some were still watching, others had gone back to their phones and laptops, like nothing had happened. That's the danger, Karen. Silence, not just from you, but from everyone who sees something and chooses to pretend it didn't happen. Her voice cracked just slightly. I didn't mean to. The jet bridge was narrow, filled with that usual blend of stale air and humming lights. But as Robert and Ethan walked side by side, it felt like stepping into a different kind of pressure, one with consequences waiting on the other end. Inside the plane, the flight crew had already been informed. A woman in her late 40s, wearing the same Navy uniform as Karen, but with warmer eyes and steadier hands, greeted them immediately. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we're so sorry about what happened at the gate. Your seats are ready, and Ethan, if you'd like to visit the cockpit before takeoff, we'd be happy to show you around." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Really?" she smiled. "Really? The captain's a fan of your dad." Robert placed a hand on his son's back. "Go on. I'll be right here." As Ethan followed the attendant to the front of the plane, Robert watched him with a mixture of pride and something else, an ache deep and familiar. He had grown used to seeing things like this play out, but it never stopped hitting a nerve when it touched his own family. He sat down in seat 2A and pulled out his phone. No corporate emails, not yet. Instead, he opened a notepad and typed a message to his chief of staff. "Gate agent at Sacramento Terminal C-12, incident involving unaccompanied minor. Security footage flagged. Request internal review and retraining evaluation. I'll handle the report. This one's personal." He hit send, leaned back and stared out of the window as the jet bridge pulled away. Back in the terminal, the aftermath had already begun. The supervisor, Dean Rosner, stood near the desk with Kevin, now off duty but lingering nearby. Karen remained at her post, silent and still, staring at the screen like it would erase the memory of what had happened. Dean spoke quietly. "You understand what's coming, right?" She didn't look up. "Disciplinary review, at the very least." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't mean." "I know what you meant," he said, "but meaning something and doing it are two different things. You acted without cause, that's documented. You singled out a child, didn't follow protocol, and now there's a fire under us from the top. You've got a file now, Karen, a serious one." She said nothing, but the weight of it was sinking in. Meanwhile, Kevin stood with his arms crossed, not smug, not satisfied, just watching. "You could have handled it different," he said. "You had the info. The manifest was flagged. You just didn't care." Karen finally snapped, voice sharp but low. "Don't pretend like you've never missed something." "I have," Kevin replied, "but I've never shredded a kid's ticket because he didn't look like someone I expected." Dean cut in. "All right, that's enough. HR will handle the rest." Kevin took a breath and walked off, not bothering with a goodbye. Back on the plane, Ethan returned from the cockpit, smiling just slightly. "Dad," he said, "they said I could press one of the buttons before we take off." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Did you ask what it did first?" "I'm not trying to launch the cargo door mid-air," Ethan grinned. Robert laughed, and for the first time that day, it felt real. A few minutes later, the flight attendants gave their safety demo, passengers buckled in, and the cabin settled. Ethan turned in his seat. "Are you mad at her?" Robert paused. "No." "Why not?" "Because getting angry is easy," he said. "Making sure it never happens again, that's harder. That's where the work is." Ethan leaned back, quiet again. "She looked at me like I didn't belong there." "I know. I didn't like that. You're not supposed to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his mom's note, creased now from how tightly he'd held it. Still gonna look for the mountains, he mumbled. Robert looked out the window. You'll see them, and a lot more. Just don't ever let someone like her make you question if you belong in the seat you earned. Ethan nodded. But even as the plane lifted into the sky, Robert knew the conversation wasn't finished, because the system that allowed this to happen wasn't grounded at the gate. It was everywhere, and that was going to take more than one flight to fix. By the time the plane leveled above the clouds, the city behind them looked small, flattened into patches of light and shadow, like the whole world could be zipped into a suitcase and stored in the overhead bin. Ethan leaned toward the window, forehead pressed to the plastic. I think I see snow on the mountains. Robert glanced over. Could be Mount Shasta. Looks like powdered sugar. Ethan chuckled quietly. The tension from the gate hadn't vanished, but at this altitude, it felt like they could breathe again. The flight was just under 2 hours, smooth skies, the usual soft rustle of newspapers, headphones clicking on, passengers settling into their mid-air rituals. At one point, a different flight attendant, Sharon, her name stitched in neat cursive, approached with 2 glasses of water and a folded note. This was passed from the gate supervisor before takeoff, she whispered. He said it's for you. Robert unfolded it. Mr. Miller, we're reviewing all recent gate interactions across terminals, starting tomorrow. I know a formal apology isn't enough, but we'll do better. Dean Rosner. He folded the note slowly, slid it into his coat pocket. Across the aisle, an older man, mid-60s, silver buzz cut, worn denim jacket, leaned slightly over. Your boy? He asked. Robert turned. He is. He handled himself real calm back there. Most kids would have lost it. He's been taught not to, Robert said. The man nodded, then glanced at Ethan. My grandson's around his age. Kids like him, they got to be twice as patient, huh? Robert didn't answer right away. Twice as patient, 3 times as careful, and still things happen. The man gave a knowing nod, then sat back in his seat. He didn't say another word for the rest of the flight. He didn't need to. Ethan stretched his legs and yawned. Will they fire her? I don't know, Robert replied. Do you want them to? No, he said. I want them to understand why it matters, why it always mattered. People don't learn when you just erase them. They learn when they're forced to see what they couldn't before. Ethan looked down at his sketchbook, finally opening it for the first time since boarding. He started to draw mountains, clouds, a long plane slicing across the sky. You think she'll remember this? He asked. I think it'll follow her, Robert said. Good. They didn't talk much for the rest of the flight, but the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It held something else, understanding maybe, or just the relief of being past the worst part. Your boy? He asked. Robert turned. He is. He handled himself real calm back there. Most kids would have lost it. He's been taught not to, Robert said. The man nodded, then glanced at Ethan. My grandson's around his age. Kids like him, they got to be twice as patient, huh? Robert didn't answer right away. Twice as patient, 3 times as careful, and still things happen. The man gave a knowing nod, then sat back in his seat. He didn't say another word for the rest of the flight. He didn't need to. Ethan stretched his legs and yawned. Will they fire her? I don't know, Robert replied. Do you want them to? No, he said. I want them to understand why it matters, why it always mattered. People don't learn when you just erase them. They learn when they're forced to see what they couldn't before. Ethan looked down at his sketchbook, finally opening it for the first time since boarding. He started to draw mountains, clouds, a long plane slicing across the sky. "You think she'll remember this?" he asked. "I think it'll follow her," Robert said. "Good." They didn't talk much for the rest of the flight, but the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It held something else. Understanding, maybe, or just the relief of being past the worst part. 2 days after the flight, Robert sat in his office on the 22nd floor of a high-rise in downtown Oakland. The windows behind him gave a wide view of the bay, the bridge stretching in the distance, fog curling like fingers around the skyline. But Robert wasn't looking outside. He was rereading an email, one from Dean Rosner. "Mr. Miller, Colleen Davis has been placed on administrative leave pending full review, as per your recommendation. We are launching a system-wide training initiative focused on bias recognition, de-escalation, and youth passenger engagement. I appreciate your restraint and your reminder that accountability is more than punishment. Sincerely, Dean Rosner." He closed the message and leaned back in his chair. There wasn't any joy in it, no satisfaction in being right, but there was a quiet steadiness that came from knowing something had shifted. Not everything, but something. His assistant knocked and peeked in. "You've got your 2:30 with the legal team, and a voicemail from the Sacramento Gate rep," she said. "Oh, and a woman stopped by asking for a meeting with you. Name Colleen Davis." He sighed. "Set it for next week. 10 minutes, no longer. We'll do it then." When she closed the door, Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out Ethan's boarding pass, or what was left of it. He'd kept the torn halves, not out of spite, but as a reminder, a real one, paper-thin but heavy with meaning. Later that evening, Ethan called from camp. "They let us build drones today," he said. "Mine flew straight into a tree." Robert chuckled. "At least it took off." "Yeah, I'll send you a picture when I get it out of the branches. How's everything else?" Ethan paused. "Good, but guess what?" "What?" "There's this other kid from Texas. He asked me what I want to be when I grow up. I told him I don't know. He said, 'You look like you're going to run stuff one day.'" Robert smiled. "He's not wrong. I didn't feel like that at the airport." "I know," Robert said softly. "But one day, maybe someone will see you, and instead of making assumptions, they'll remember your name, not because of what I built, but because of who you are." Ethan didn't respond right away. "I drew her, by the way," he said eventually. "Who?" "The woman from the gate. I drew her face. Not mean or anything, just regular. I put her behind a desk and wrote the words, 'Do better,' on the glass window." Robert let that land. "That's a good drawing, yeah. I think I'll keep it." They said their goodnights, and the call ended. Robert sat quietly in the dark office for a moment longer. What happened at that gate wasn't rare. That was the part most people didn't understand. It wasn't a shock, it was a pattern. But patterns can be broken, not with noise, with action, with naming things when it's easier to let them slide, with raising a son who knew how to stay composed when the ground shifted beneath him. Not everyone has the luxury of a father in the first-class lounge ready to step in, and that's why silence can't be an option. Not at airports, not at school, not anywhere. So if you're watching this right now and thinking, "I've seen something like this happen," or "I've been Ethan," or even "I've been quiet when I shouldn't have been," you're not alone. And that's the lesson here. Silence doesn't protect, it permits. And when people finally speak, really speak, systems start to shift. If this story moved you, share it. Not for views, but for awareness, for accountability, and for every kid who's just trying to get to their seat without being treated like a problem. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on recognition. And next time you see something that doesn't sit right, don't look away. Say something.